Welcome to the Pharmacy Leaders Podcast with your host, Tony Guerra. The Pharmacy Leaders Podcast is a member of the Pharmacy Podcast Network, with interviews and advice on building your professional network, brand, and a purposeful second income from students, residents, and innovative professionals.
Hey, welcome to the Pharmacy Leaders Podcast. Today I have Sean Kane, who has a website that you may or may not know of. It's called ClinCalc. And it has a ton of content on there. And what I wanted to do was go through with him not only about the website and how it can help you, especially if you're trying to study for the NAPLEX and kind of trying to figure out some of the calculations and making sure that you're right and things like that, but also to understand how we can integrate IT and things like that into our pharmacy practice, especially clinical practice. He's been on talking about residency interviews, and now that you're about to get into your residency, how can you make the best of it? So, Sean, welcome to the Pharmacy Leaders Podcast.
Hey, Tony. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, for those that don't know you, we've not talked to you for about 6 months or a year. Let's get a little bit of background on how you got into even just creating as simple as a web page, and then kind of what problem were you trying to fix that made you or pushed you towards actually helping others and just saying, here's a bunch of free content. I solved this problem, it'll help you as well.
Sure. Yeah. So, when I was in pharmacy school, most of my colleagues were doing retail pharmacy jobs, and I did a little bit of that, and then I quickly transitioned into basically working for the university with web application development. So making web pages, under the university umbrella at the time as a student. And I didn't really do much with that professionally in pharmacy school until I started my PGY1 at UIC, University of Illinois at Chicago. And during my PGY1 residency, we had a lot of pharmacy-to-dose vancomycins where I was spending a lot of time doing the calculations that I learned in pharmacokinetics in school, spending a lot of time on generating a progress note for the electronic health record. And I thought to myself, there must be a better way, right? And usually that's what people say when they think about the better way. So what I ended up doing was I made a web page that did, a very basic pharmacokinetic calculation for vancomycin, and it generated a progress note. And that saved me a ton of time with all the pharmacy-to-dose vancomycins that I got. And that really is what snowballed into what is now ClinCalc and some of the other projects that are kind of shoot-offs of ClinCalc as well.
Okay, well, let's actually talk about residency and saving time and making it a little bit easier on ourselves. Some people talk about the number of hours at residency like a badge of courage, but I think of it as more of a badge of inefficiency. They're like, I worked 70 hours last week, and I'm thinking,
right.
Why? Why? What inefficiencies are there that maybe you can look at? And although I, applaud you for getting up before the sun comes up and leaving after the sun goes down, what are some of the major things that someone who's never done residency before are going to come into, and it's just a time suck, just something that just absolutely just takes up so much of your time that maybe there could be some efficiency there?
Well, I think part of that is the learning curve. So why are you doing residency in the first place? It's because you think that there's a lot more room for growth, and you want to have that growth over a shorter period of time. So for me, of course you still have rounds, you have patient care responsibilities, staffing responsibilities. For me, it was on-call responsibilities. And at the end of the day, what ended up happening is you kind of package your improvement of knowledge and improvement of clinical skills over a shorter than normal period of time to kind of jumpstart things a little bit. So some of those inefficiencies do deal with, just trying to figure out how to be a pharmacist. And part of that is there's a lot to know and a lot to go through. And, even through 2 years of residency, I still feel like I'm learning. I still feel like I'm improving. To some degree, I don't know that there's a big fix to make that 70-hour week more like a 40-hour week. But I think part of it is this: what are your priorities for that 1 or 2 years versus offsetting it over a longer period of time?
And you did PGY1, PGY2. I know some of them are connected, and I know there's early, it's not early placement, but something where you can kind of commit to that PGY2. That's a really quick process. Do you have any tips on what people can do in the first 3 months or something like that to see if if that PGY2 is available, how they kind of make that decision.
Yeah. I mean, at least for me, my PGY 1 year, there were multiple people who were interested in staying on as a PGY 2. So my institution did not early commit any of us, which meant that all of us were interviewing and things like that. But even if they had that as an option where they only interviewed internally, really especially your PGY 1 year, that's an opportunity for an extended job interview, right? Just like your APPE rotations, especially a longitudinal APPE, you've got several months to basically show that you've got what it takes to be a great pharmacist and interface well at that institution. So like with APPEs and your PGY 1, both similarly, I think you really need to figure out how to distinguish yourself, how to show that you're working really hard and do all the stuff that they're expecting you to do with the due dates on time and things like that, so that they're more likely to want to hire you for a PGY2 or even a clinical position at some point.
So when you made this app or something like that, tell me a little bit how you presented it. At first, I'm sure you just kind of used it for yourself, made sure things worked. But at what point can you say, hey, I've got a way to make that a lot faster? Where do you go? Do you go to your fellow residents and kind of introduce it to them? I remember the Facebook movie Social Network, where what he did was he actually just sent it to a couple of his friends and saw his friends send it to his friends. He didn't go to his residency director and go, I have a time-saving, panacea for the department. I will save us millions of dollars. So how did you kind of spread it around a little bit?
So, to give you context again, I was commuting basically 4 hours a day, so 2 hours on 2 different trains getting there and back because of kind of where I needed to live for personal reasons and then where I matched to. So I had a lot of time to work on this and think about this idea that ended up being ClinCalc, in addition to doing other work that I needed to get done so I didn't have to take as much home when I actually was home. But I'm sure that you're familiar with this, the imposter syndrome, right?
Yeah. Where you feel like you don't belong, yeah.
Exactly. So that's how I felt with this app. I felt like, what am I doing wrong? This seems not too easy, but it just didn't feel like I was the right person to be doing this. And as I grew it and as I thought more about it, it felt like, this is a really good resource for other people that would be interested in it, right? And it saves me time. It's an educational tool because it kind of walks through calculations and shows you the math and things like that. There's a lot of value there. And eventually it kind of, you hopefully grow out of that imposter syndrome. And, that's when you start sharing it with more people and then kind of word of mouth gets around. And that's kind of where things take off, I think. But for me personally, I've never been super into self-promotion and things like that, partially because of the imposter syndrome and partially because this is, to be fair, mostly made for myself, not for other people, but I appreciate the value that it can bring as well.
Okay. Well, let's actually go through your mobile apps. I just recently caught wind of your RX Hero because I had trained pharmacy technicians, and one of the big things is the top 200 drugs. You've got the top 250 in there. And recently, the accreditation document actually changed the percentage for pharmacy technicians, so it's significantly more pharmacology because they've really separated community and then IV or sterile compounding practice. And so to fill that void, they filled it with pharmacology. But let's go through kind of the development of your mobile apps. I think you had 4, if I remember right.
Yeah.
And can you kind of go through them in more of a chronological, like how I built this? I don't want to, Guy Raz isn't going to call me and like, hey, you used my show. But I kind of would like to hear the evolution of how you kind of got these together because now you're on your 4th app and kind of a veteran, I guess.
Yeah. Well, so it really started my PGY 1 year. So previous to PGY 1, all I ever did was web-based development. So web pages and web applications, stuff like that. And at this time, so this was in 2010, 2011, this is when iPhone apps were really starting to get more popular. More people were starting to get Android and iPhones and stuff like that. So it really hit this critical mass where apps were a really big deal. and I knew nothing about how to make them, and I wanted to. So one of the preceptors at UIC, Rob DiDomenico, I approached him and asked if he would be interested in partnering with me and making like a custom PGY1 rotation that was focused on making an Android and an iPhone version of a nomogram that he had developed for digoxin dosing. So we talked about it, and we made it not just his nomogram, but we made it into digoxin dosing in general. And then I kind of did some self-taught approach in terms of how to make these apps, given that I already had some background knowledge with programming. And the end result of that 4-week rotation was coming up with this iPhone and Android app that UIC published under their account of, for free, of dosing digoxin for AFib, for heart failure, and then, going through all the math and validating it and going through that whole process. And that really got the ball rolling, mostly, just for me to be familiar with what is the process to make an app, right? And that's really where things got started.
So this first, let's define a nomogram. It's like 3 or more variables, right, in one, and you're trying to kind of put all these together, like age, renal function, things like that. Could you kind of go over what a nomogram is?
Sure. Yeah, so like nomogram from a pharmacokinetic standpoint basically is a way that you can estimate someone's dose using more of a picture as opposed to going through a bunch of math equations. So the nomogram that Rob DiDomenico had developed and published dealt with digoxin dosing for heart failure patients. And basically you kind of plot a patient's height, gender, or ideal body weight on the y-axis, and then on the x-axis you can figure out what their dose is based on other variables that you're putting into this nomogram. In this case, it was renal function on the x-axis. So then you kind of plot ideal body weight versus renal function, and then you figure out what is their anticipated dose without having to do any of the more traditional digoxin calculations that you would normally have to do in order to come up with an empiric dose of digoxin for a heart failure patient.
Okay. And so that's not on your website, but what was the next one that kind of came in the chronology? So you kind of cut your teeth on the digoxin. You gave that out free, or it's available free. What was your next step?
So the next one was ICU Trials, and that was an app, and still is, that basically summarizes landmark clinical trials in critical care literature. So, again, as a PGY1, you go on these different rotations, and you kind of learn that most of guidelines come from just a handful of clinical trials that have really impacted how you take care of patients with whatever disease state. So in the case of critical care, you could easily come up with a list of like 50 of the most pivotal trials in critical care medicine. And if you're interested in being an ICU clinician, you should probably be familiar with those. So what this app did was it basically made a Spark Notes or Cliff Notes version of some of these trials, and then gave you links so that you could go read the full trials if you wanted to do that through PubMed. And the value here obviously is that on rounds, and you want to know, what was the hydrocortisone dose that they used in the Corticus trial do, and what did they see, and things like that. And then, even send a link to a colleague if you wanted to share that trial with them.
So I guess maybe just some advice for the resident who's looking at this saying, great, so there are only 80 pivotal trials that I need to learn all at once on the first day. Yeah. So
yeah, or when someone says, hey, did you know the Corticus trial, right? And you might say, I think so. Now you can look it up and get the reference and then go read it yourself without having to Google Corticus and come up with a bunch of other results that aren't related to the question that you're asking.
Cool. All right, well, what came next?
So then after that was probably FlashRx, and that was basically a flashcard top 200 drugs quizzing app that is very customizable, so you can add in your own drugs and remove drugs from a pre-built database so that you can quiz yourself on these top 200 drugs. And
so somebody would ask, well, what's the difference between that and Quizlet? Besides that, my advice to students is never use Quizlet cards that you haven't made, because it doesn't say, hey, this was an A student that made these cards.
Right.
It could
Yeah.
have been somebody that didn't pass pharmacology making
Mhm.
cards. So what's the difference maybe between
Yeah.
FlashRx and Quizlet?
So one thing is that it has like a quiz function, so you can have a multiple choice format in addition to a flashcard format. And then I'm hugely into what's called adaptive flashcards or adaptive learning,
Okay.
which basically is a process where when you are more familiar with a fact, so the brand name of Montelukast, for example,
Mm-hmm.
when you're more familiar with that, you should be quizzed on that less often, and you should be quizzed more often on facts that you don't know at all or that you've missed in the past and gotten them incorrect. It's a time saver. So now you're focusing your time on stuff that is new or that you guessed incorrectly, and spending less time, but still spending some time on these drug facts that you've already demonstrated competency for, but you don't want to forget either.
Yeah, I know the NAPLEX is no longer adaptive, but I know that the NCLEX is. So for nurses who are interested in kind of improving their pharmacology, their final test ends up, if they get it right, then they get a harder question. If they get it wrong, they get an easier
Yep.
question, and it kind of goes up and down. And my understanding with an adaptive test is that you want to take your time on the first 10 to get up really high, and then you can miss one, get one, miss one, get one, but you remain high. So
Yeah.
that's what I've heard is the strategy. So then comes Vank, the Vank mobile calculator.
Yeah. So basically, an adaptation of that original web page,
Okay.
but made on a mobile application, really very similar to what you'd see on the web page. And then the last one was what I just recently released called RX Hero, which is very similar to Flash RX, except it's in this like gamification format where you get points, you get levels and ranks and stuff like that. And it's just in a different, more playful format for students that are really trying to quiz themselves and get better on those top 200 drugs.
Well, let's talk a little bit about gamification because I think it's sometimes misunderstood as games versus elements of games. So gamification, as I understand it, is using elements of gameplay to just keep you engaged with something, to keep you moving. You're tired at the end of the day. The last thing you want to do is look at another drug,
Right.
and it motivates you. So where did you get your education on gamification, and how did you make the choices you did?
So a lot of that comes from personal experience with another app called Duolingo, which is
Okay.
a language learning app.
Yeah, sure.
And that's a really popular app to learn all sorts of different languages where they've implemented point-based systems and, all sorts of these gamification principles that basically keep you engaged in the app longer and make you have a more enjoyable experience than a simple like flashcard going back and forth. When you just have that very basic format, you're not going to be as engaged, as like interested in continuing it. But if you're trying to get to that next level, get a couple more points, competing with a colleague, you're much more likely to delve deeper into it, which means that you're going to get better at that topic.
Sure. And I know that I think I remember it's actually free to try. You can download it. You can use one of the topics, and I think the topic you get for free is cardio. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yep, there's like 30 something drugs in there, and you can kind of see what it feels like to have that gamification, component and what the app looks like and things like that.
Okay. Well, let's actually talk a little bit about maybe the actual development side. So, after work, I guess I'm picturing you going on the elevated train or the L, and you're going home, and you're sitting there typing out all of this code, and you've got maybe 3 screens on your home computer. What does it actually look like to make an app?
A lot of it deals with the planning stage. So the actual coding itself is, difficult, but not as time consuming as creating an app that people want to use that has content that is accurate and relevant and things like that. So, in the case of RX Hero, just developing the underlying database that has all the facts in it, you would think that would be really simple, but it's not. A great example would be
aspirin.
Sure, aspirin. Thinking about how many side effects do you want the user to know about aspirin,
Sure.
and then how do you decide which side effects? Let's say you say 3 seems like a good number. So what 3 do you pick, and why do you pick them? And I feel like you should have a process for coming up with that, so that not every drug has diarrhea and headache as a side effect, because that's not helpful and also not accurate, right?
Yeah, so you're talking about percentages, that it's on there because it happened to someone, but it's not the clinical pearl that you really want to,
Exactly.
kind of take away and make your therapeutic decisions. Okay,
Exactly.
well, I've asked you a bunch of questions about this. I know a lot of students are always interested in technology or looking into new things. How would a student that's maybe in school right now get into app development, or even just doing the web pages and things like that? I know people are on their phones, with Insta, and I think Facebook is out for anyone under my age, but Insta, Snap, and those things. So they're on their phone and they use their phone. And I think it would be really cool to do things for their phone. But what would be a first step for a student?
There are so many free, really good resources out there for app development. Everything from YouTube, which kind of varies in quality, all the way to like my local library has some really good books and even online resources through my library that are phenomenal in terms of just learning about app development and stuff like that. So having that resource is really important, and then starting somewhere, but starting small. So, you can't make a huge, crazy, blockbuster, multifunctional app in a day. So maybe starting with something as simple as like a creatinine clearance calculator, where the math is not difficult, there's not that many inputs and things like that, and you're really just trying to get your feet wet. And the more times you are trying these like smaller potentially doing something bigger in the future if that's something you want to do.
Okay, awesome. Well, I've asked you a lot of questions. Is there anything you want to get out that I didn't ask you about?
I think that IT in general is kind of an underrepresented area of pharmacy in terms of potential career paths. I know that informatics is out there, but I would almost argue that what we're talking about today is not the same as what most people call informatics. This is something different where you're creating something new, you're leveraging more of this creative aspect as opposed to just using software that already exists. So I'd argue that anyone that has any IT background or wants to have an IT background, this is definitely a niche in the market within pharmacy that I think is underdeveloped and undertapped. If you're looking for that side project or just trying to develop better as a clinical pharmacist in the future, this is something to think about in terms of distinguishing yourself away from the crowd and maybe even coming up with a whole new career path for yourself.
Sounds good. Well, Sean Kane, thanks so much for being on the Pharmacy Leaders Podcast.
Yeah. Thank you, Tony.
Support for this episode comes from the audiobook Memorizing Pharmacology, a relaxed approach. With over 9,000 sales in the United States, United Kingdom, and Australia, it's the go-to resource to ease the pharmacology challenge. Available on Audible, iTunes, and Amazon.com, in print, ebook, and audiobook. Thank you for listening to the Pharmacy Leaders Podcast with your host, Tony Guerra. Be sure to share the show with the hashtag #PharmacyLeaders.